Okay, so the context of this session is sub-Saharan Africa, largely, but in contrast with here, like this immediate area. So my background is that I'm an academic at UCL. I work in the Institute of Education, so I'm thinking about education all the time. I have a role as graduate tutor, so within the Institute we have getting on for 1,000 postgraduate, well, doctoral students before we add on the master's students, so it's quite big business in IOE. We have a correspondingly large number of supervisors. So the equipping and developing of supervisors is quite a big issue for us. I'm going to have to give you the background because you won't otherwise understand the context of the peer assessment, but I will skip through what's on the slides, and if you're more interested. So we know that globally, not just in the global south, equipping for the task of doctoral supervisors is typically undervalued in universities. We also know that doctoral completion rates are low, and that matters. That's true across the globe. There have been substantial changes in the nature of doctoral work over the last 20, 30 years. From a focus on the nurture of embryonic researchers to something which is much, much wider. The situation in the UK is that the UK Council for Graduate Education, those initials are the wrong way around, has recently introduced accreditation of experienced doctoral supervisors. And the aim of that is to incentivize systematic reflection on supervision by those who've already built up some experience. There is an assumption that once you've got a doctorate, you can supervise doctoral candidates, end of story. Whereas we know from quite a lot of evidence that actually that's not quite the whole story. What have we done? Well, starting in the Institute of Education, we've adopted a design research approach to running a series of collaborative workshops that support experienced supervisor development and accreditation. You need some sort of incentive for this because academics' time is very carefully controlled. The UK CGE accreditation has developed in quite a short time a really good status. And it's very carefully thought out. So by aligning workshops with preparation for a successful application for this accreditation, we hoped that we would get both participation and the accreditation. Our first series of workshops involved two critical friends, one from Egypt and one from the University of Johannesburg, and that collaboration with the South African academic led to the instigation of a similar approach across three universities, one in South Africa, one in Namibia, one in Zambia in 2022. And then a comparative nature to the associated research that was about, well, how do supervisors in Southern Africa in our study develop, how do they respond to these sorts of structures compared with ours in UCL? So our first research question really was, how do we design this? As I say, it was a design research-based model. And then the second question was about comparative education of doctoral supervisors. And there's a bit there about the data collection and the analysis. key finding really for this afternoon is that across the board on those first two series of workshops, academic colleagues identified two linked but separate and significant benefits to them. So one was interactive collaborative workshops. I'll tell you a bit about those, from which they had quite an investment in, because we structured it like that. And then a separate benefit from crafting their own application for recognition. And really the link between those two was a peer formative assessment phase, which we introduced after the first iteration. So those were our 6 core workshops, and we required colleagues who wanted to participate in these to take responsibility either on their own or with a colleague, with organising and delivering one of these half sessions, with some guidelines about interactivity and all the things that we're coming to know about distance learning. So the importance of actively involving colleagues and so on. The accreditation has specific requirements in terms of its assessment. So you're required to produce a reflective account of your supervision, plus some references, but the account has to be personal. So it's about what you do with your institution's structures. It has to be comparatively recent. It has to be analytical rather than descriptive. It has to be to include specific examples. This is the challenge I identified. This is what I did about it. And this is how I know that it worked or needs further tweaking or whatever it is. It has to be scholarly. So it has to be embedded in the supervision literature, and it has to be systematic. And we got really good feedback from the first iteration, but with some room for improvement. So in line with all the literature on distance learning, colleagues really appreciating breakout rooms, in-depth discussion, benefiting from one another's specific experience. Comparatively small group in order that we could require that degree of investment. And the remote medium appeared to work well there. For the small group, which made it relatively easy to make it active, and those interactive structures built in. But relatively experienced colleagues, they all applied for their recognition, and at first attempt, a number of senior colleagues did not get it, due despair and despondency, and there's something wrong with the system. At second attempt, they all did, so eventually they all calmed down, and after discussion, agreed to invest in a second attempt. But that really brought home that you can make assumptions about how easy it is to respond to particular requirements, but it doesn't necessarily mean that even experienced academic colleagues can respond to that in the intended way. I mean, when you read some of these very experienced supervisor accounts, you very often saw that they were not always analytic. They were not always systematic or example-based as they were supposed to be, because colleagues essentially assumed that their experience would see them through. I have to say that the colleagues concerned who didn't succeed at first attempt were very gracious in the medium term and said how much they had benefited from having to redraft what they were going to do. But as a consequence, we introduced, for the Southern African context, where we were already looking at supervisors who had less opportunity, very often from school level onwards, to develop systematic reflective approaches to education. But we introduced peer opportunity to engage in peer assessment of the 6 core workshops. So as participants were beginning to draft their applications, we introduced a session which looked at the criteria, worked with those who wanted to participate on assessing actually genuine applications in terms of the personal, recent, analytic, example-based, scholarly and systematic criteria. And then if they participated in that session, they were committing to peer reviewing one another's draft applications and feeding back on that. And feeding back, of course, adds something to that that makes demands as well. And it's been very interesting to look at what experienced colleagues found difficult about both those processes. There is a reasonable theoretical background to everything that's going on here, but not a lot of literature around formative peer assessment when it comes to academic professional development. And not a lot about African academics development altogether. After the Southern African iteration, we then had next iteration in IOE, and then the 4th iteration is about to kick off, and this is what it looks like. It's being led by successful colleagues from the 1st iteration in Southern Africa, and it's across 10 sub-Saharan countries in 2 parallel strands. And the peer assessment is going to be really, really interesting because we're putting together in one melting pot all sorts of sub-Saharan cultures, many of which carry quite heavy expectations in terms of power relations between those who are more senior and power relations of men in relation to women. So these are the really interesting things, of course. When you're thinking about peer assessment in this sort of context, there are some well-documented advantages that you expect to see extrapolating from other university contexts, such as depth of engagement with the assessment criteria, such as learning, especially from the crafting of the formative feedback. So what are the priorities here? How do I communicate those with consideration for the recipient as a person who's invested in this assignment in the first place? So one of the core issues in sub-Saharan Africa is that systematic, reflective practice in education as a whole has a comparatively low profile. You're looking at countries where even the most advanced, probably South Africa, have very recent development of large-scale universal education or near universal education. And much of that has been slow. Well, no, it hasn't. It's been actually quite quick in trying to adopt learner-centered practices, but without the skills that underpin that because of the explosion in demand for education, really. So some of the approaches which we in education in the UK still find demanding are just not possible in many sub-Saharan contexts. So this was the reason I pointed to UCL colleagues finding this process demanding, is that it's then several times as demanding if you're a sub-Saharan academic, because of the educational backgrounds and the post-colonial context. In both contexts, getting to analytic writing rather than descriptive was enormously challenging, really, for academics. Cultural constraints, yes, obvious in Southern Africa, but actually there too within UCL, we're not immune to them over here. Across all three iterations we've had so far, it's been very typical that our academic colleagues who engage with the scholarly literature in their own field of research don't when it comes to their doctoral supervision. And actually there's quite a corpus out there. The problem, well, a major problem really for our sub-Saharan African colleagues is that there is supervision literature emanating from Africa, but it's not well respected or valued elsewhere. Feedback to academic peers, of course, is different from feedback to students, but a lot of the reflection on that has been, but I have learned a lot for my doctoral students from feeding back to colleagues. I'm much more sensitive to them as people. Colleagues are required to separate their personal contributions to supervision from that of their institutions and to critique their institutions in doing so. Critique their institutions' approaches and systems in doing so. That's quite hard if you're in a newly developed university where, I mean, managerialism in Southern Africa is a different scale of problem from what it is even in UCL. You need to see what there is in UCL. But it's again because of the rapid development of universities, and actually you need lots of rules and systems in place if you're going to drag people who are very often barely equipped for doing what you're asking of them. If you're going to take them with you, you need lots of structures. So particularly in Southern Africa, you have mega issues of power everywhere you look, in relation to your institution, in relation to your colleagues, in relation to your tribal background. So that tribal identity is really, really important to sub-Saharan African people. And it gives them such a rich life outlook, but it brings also all sorts of assumptions and challenges for conforming to what are essentially Western ways of valuing and working within academia. Their own research, they struggle to publish, and it's very often not widely valued elsewhere. Been there, we've seen that in Western universities. Why would we be interested? Well, actually, because this can tell us something different, because it's coming from a different context. And again, traditional African ways of knowing are undervalued in our systems. So I went to one of the sessions this morning, talked about a teaspoon of planning and a bucketful of, I think they called it trial and error. I mean, hopefully we can move a bit towards trial and improvement, but this peer review has majored on that. So yeah, as I got to know our colleagues in Southern Africa, it became apparent that some of these were likely to be issues. Nevertheless, actually dealing with them is on the ground, and as they emerge and become apparent is another matter. One way was to ensure that all peer reviews were anonymised. And we did that in UCL as well. There's every reason to. Nevertheless, you can't get away from it entirely. Lots and lots of listening and attempts at empathy, and lots of, you know, tell us why you're saying that, and does that reflecting back, I think so. Does that accord with other people's experience. If it's the same, why is it the same, and what do you do about it? And if it's different, why is it different? And all the while, a sensitivity from me that actually, you know, I'm the white person from a well-resourced university, introducing a structure that I thought up that leads to accreditation by a UK body, and therefore there are a number of parallel initiatives that we're working on. One is an annotated bibliography of sub-Saharan literature around supervision, which we hope will, at least for African academics, rebalance the story, the academic stories that are out there, but hopefully more widely. We've published a book on doctoral supervision as academic practice on the basis of this. And then, as I say, we're rolling out more widely in sub-Saharan Africa with plans to institute an African supervision recognition scheme, which will look similar, but different from the UK scheme, but actually is really important in terms of labellings and respecting the similar but different things that our African colleagues bring to supervision. So that's me. If you would like to be in touch, but otherwise, basically, that's the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennie.